I'd wanted to do this outside, but it's colder than I thought. When it's 50 degrees in San Diego, this is how we dress. I had driven 2 days, 30 hours, 2,000 plus miles to get from San Diego to Louisville in August 1980. I had slept in my sleeping bag on top of my '74 Blue Nova somewhere in northeastern Oklahoma, in Cherokee Nation territory, much to my mom's chagrin. Arriving on the afternoon of the third day, I was less than thrilled to find my living space at the seminary was a tiny monastic room in a men's only dorm. Oof, a step way back socially. I was tired, and since I was the only Baylor grad to go to Southern that year, somehow everyone else thought that the San Francisco seminary was a sexier choice. I was ready to hop back in my car and head home. At that moment, I met Tom Barry, who lived in the tiny room across the hall. Tom was a North Florida grad, looked like a taller Woody Allen, had my same weird sense of humor, along with an absolute passion for theology and justice. We became friends. He introduced me to many of my best seminary friends, too, including the Reverend Cindy Weber, who is still pastor of Jeff Street Baptist in Louisville, which is Clarence Jordan's old church. Being from Florida, Tom either understood me or pretended to. He was a year ahead of me. His first assignment was a youth minister at Neptune Baptist Church in Jacksonville, where he served for 12 years. After 2 years in Tennessee, he returned as pastor at Neptune Baptist, an interracial congregation right on the beach in Jacksonville. He started there in '96, where he served for 24 more years until his death last Christmas from the Rona. We weren't the same personality. His energy was intense and manic, mine laid back. His last sermon before spending a month in ICU was 44 minutes long. In his honor, I thought I would preach that long today. His last message to me was when he wrote, "Michael, I was sitting in a deacon's prayer time yesterday. I was looking at the sanctuary and the deacons praying and praying as well. I thought about a moment in time, probably 1981, when you and I were sitting on a bench at Southern and we were talking about prayer. You were just talking about the unhindered experience of just sitting and praying and the freedom of talking to God, unbound by the religious trappings of posture or closing one's eyes, etc. And then we prayed. Why such a memorable moment? I can't recall, but it was. Just thought of you and wanted to say thanks. It made an impression and is still a great lesson." When you pastor, it's difficult to stay in touch with seminary friends since we are serving in different states, often across different time zones. But Tom was a friend to me when it mattered. And this morning's text in John's Gospel is a fitting reminder of Tom's friendship to me. And so to John, in many ways, it was the unlikeliest meeting. Nathaniel didn't even want to meet the guy. He was just doing a favor to his friend. I mean, honestly, the one of whom the prophet spoke, some self-appointed teacher from that backwoods little town of Nazareth. It turned out, though, that this guy, Jesus, had a decent sense of humor. He quipped right back, "Glad to meet you, Nathaniel, an Israelite without deceit." Now, this might seem like a backhanded compliment. Maybe Jesus was saying he appreciated Nathaniel speaking his mind, didn't take offense at the whole backwoods Nazareth comment. But we who are overhearing this conversation realize there's a double meaning here. Jesus calling Nathaniel an Israelite. because it brings back echoes of the Jacob story into the conversation. Jacob of the Hebrew Bible, Jacob the deceiver who would be known as Israel. This is Jesus' pun. But Nathanael is an Israelite without deceit. Well played, Jesus. Score in this conversational sparring about hometowns, 1-1. An unlikely beginning for a relationship. Wait a minute, though, Nathanael thought. Nathanael's smiling, but his mind is racing. Jesus wasn't there for the Nazareth comment. How did Jesus know what he had said? But even more, Nathanael presses further. How do he know me? Jesus says he saw Nathanael sitting under that fig tree, but it had to be an extrasensory scene, a spiritual scene. In John's story of Jesus, Jesus knows many things he should not be able to know. So Philip was right after all. Now Nathanael is convinced the traditional phrases come pouring out of Nathanael's mouth. You are the Son of God. You are the King of Israel. Jesus confirms it with yet another Jacob reference. This time to Jacob's ladder. He says, the angels will go up and descend on the human one. That is himself. He's talking about Jacob's experience at Bethel in Matthew 28 when heaven approached so close to the earth that the inhabitants of the two realms could meet. And now in Jesus, not just in one geographical place, in Jesus, the realm of God would come that near. It was an unlikely beginning to Nathanael's walk with Jesus, but why not? What is more unlikely than heaven touching earth? Heaven is where love reigns, where there is room for all of God's children at the table, where, in the words of a friend of mine, nothing's broken and no one's missing. Not at all what earth is like. We know what earth is like. These last 2 weeks. A glance through the morning papers shows us a world that could not be more different than God's realm of love. War, global warming, political gridlock, children without health care, families in cages. And yet, in Jesus, the unexpected happens. And Nathanael sees it. Heaven gets a foothold on this earth. Sojourners Jim Wallace says, in Jesus, God hit the street. Nathanael, now a follower, however unlikely, will walk that street too. I love that this passage comes up in the lectionary on this particular weekend. It reminds me of another unlikely beginning. I began last week before the Epiphany insurrection, what a phrase, thinking about Maceo Snipes. Do you know his story? Maceo Snipes must have felt a great sense of pride after he cast his first vote in the contentious 1946 Democratic primary for governor. Like many Black World War II veterans, Snipes returned home to Butler, a town in western Georgia with less than 2,000 residents, with an honorable discharge and a determination to exercise his rights as a citizen. For months, Snipes had considered the risk associated with the exercise of this franchise. Even by Jim Crow standards for racially charged elections, this was a particularly fragile time for a black man to seek to vote. The most provocative campaign issue was specifically whether any African Americans should be allowed to vote in the Democratic primary. Georgia had only allowed whites to vote in the Democratic primaries. Advocates of the whites-only primary said blacks could vote instead in the general election. But since Georgia was essentially a one-party state where winning the primary assured victory in a pro forma general election, the black vote had no influence. The Georgia political establishment vowed to defy a federal court decision earlier in 1946 that struck down the whites-only primary. So Snipes was seeking to vote in the first election held without the statewide ban on black voting. That campaign pitted one of the most racially polarizing figures in Georgia history, two-term Governor Eugene Talmadge, who pledged to reinstate the all-white primary against a somewhat more progressive James V. Carmichael. Despite threats from the Ku Klux Klan in the run-up to the July 17th primary, Maceo Snipes took the bold step to become the first African American to cast a vote in Taylor County. What happened over the next several days in Butler and 2 hours away in Monroe, Georgia, would grab headlines across the nation, especially in the African American press, and prompt a young Morehouse College student, Martin Luther King Jr., to write a letter of response to the editor of the Atlanta Constitution. The day after Snipes voted, 4 white men arrived in a pickup truck outside of his grandfather's farmhouse, where Snipes and his mother, Lula, were having dinner. The men, members of the local Klan chapter, called for Snipes, who came outside to meet them. During their encounter outside the house, Edward Williamson shot Snipes in the back. Williamson, like Snipes, was a World War II veteran. Snipes was wounded but still struggling, but still ambulatory, as he and his mother walked 3 miles. Snipes and his mother went to the home of Snipes' sister Katie, whose 2 sons, Sam and Eddie, drove their uncle to the Montgomery Hospital in Butler. Snipes waited in a hospital room that better resembled a closet as the doctor on duty attended to other patients. 6 hours lapsed from the time that Williamson shot Snipes until the doctor performed surgery to remove the bullets. There's a thread of medical neglect found in other Georgia civil rights cases. Not before he died, Snipes was talking actively with his family. The white doctor at one point said Snipes would need a transfusion, but then said it would be impossible because there was no, quote, black blood available at the hospital. Mirroring every other facet of life in the Jim Crow South, the enforced separation between blacks and whites extended to blood transfusions. Without a transfusion, Snipes died from his injuries 2 days later on July 20th. 5 days later in Monroe, 2 black couples, Roger and Dorothy Malcolm and George and May Murray Dorsey, were abducted and taken by a mob of 20 white men to the Moore's Ford Bridge above the Allapackee River near Walton and Oconee County lines. Tied to trees, they were beaten to death and shot to death. May Murray Dorsey was 7 months pregnant. Rumors began to spread throughout the community that anyone attending Snipes' funeral would meet the dead man's fate. And so in the dead of the night, the funeral director of McDougal Funeral Home in Butler, joined by Snipes' uncle Felix, buried the deceased in an unmarked grave in Butler Cemetery. To this day, no one knows the precise location of Snipes' burial site. The coroner's court convened in July 1946 to review the cause of Snipes' death. Williamson told the coroner's jury that Snipes owed him $10. Williamson, accompanied by a man named Linwood, a sawmill operator, said he went to Snipes' home to collect the debt. The exchange between the men turned hostile and escalated, he said. Williamson claimed that Snipes pulled a knife Pleading self-defense, Williamson testified that he retrieved a gun from the glove compartment of his car and shot Snipes twice. The coroner, J.D. Cook, and the jury found that Williamson's actions were justified, despite relatives' testimony that the victim neither owed Williamson any money nor possessed a knife. A young Morehouse college student, then a teenager, was deeply disturbed by the Snipes and Moore's Ford killings, and by the overall white response that suggested a misunderstanding among whites about the motives of blacks. In a letter to the editor that Martin Luther King Sr. would later say was the initial imitation of his son's developing greatness, MLK Jr. criticized the white distortion of black interests that challenged Southern white hypocrisy and provided a sophisticated statement of black goals that would carry him and the civil rights movement for the next 2 decades. Quote, "I often find when decent treatment for the Negro is urged," the young King wrote, "a certain class of people hurry to raise the scarecrow of social mingling and intermarriage. These questions have nothing to do with this case, and most people who kick up that kind of dust know that it is simple dust to obscure the real question of rights and opportunities. It is fair to remember that the total of race mixture in America has come not by Negro initiative, but by the acts of those very white men who talk loudest of race purity. We aren't eager to marry white girls, and we would like to have our own girls left alone by both white toughs and the white aristocrats. We want," he continued, "and we are entitled to the basic rights and opportunities of American citizens, the right to earn a living at work at which we are fitted by training and ability, equal opportunities in education, health, recreation, and similar public services, the right to vote, equality before the law, some of the same courtesy and manners that we ourselves bring to all human relations." By taking the risk of voting under the threat of death, by his struggles to survive a bullet and medical neglect, and by inspiring the man who would go on to lead perhaps the most significant movement in American history, Maceo Snipes, in the end, prevailed. And so when the Reverend Dr. Raphael Gamaliel Warnock was elected in Georgia to the U.S. Senate 75 years after Snipes' murder, many of us who formerly lived in Georgia, as Ann and I did for 6 years, we remembered Snipes' courage. There is a long line of courage and love that connects his bravery to those of Warnock through the lives of many, many others. My friend, the Reverend Tom Berry, Nathaniel the Apostle, the brave World War II veteran Maceo Snipes, a teenage Martin Luther King Jr., and now the Reverend Dr. Senator Warnock. They point to this truth. Heaven is where love reigns, where there's room for all God's children at the table, where nothing's broken and no one's missing. Because in Jesus, the unexpected happens. In Jesus, God hits the streets. These followers hit the streets with him, and mighty things happen. We can too.